Welcome back, everybody. Good afternoon. We'll be starting in just a few moments, but for now, I guess, just get comfortable and ready to sit back and take in this lecture. About 5.5 minutes until the official class time. So hope you're having a good day so far, had a good weekend, and welcome back. Hey guys, good to see you. How was my weekend? It's pretty good. It's still not a lot of grading work this early in the semester, so I've had a lot of time to just relax. Yeah, pretty nice. Now it's February. Do you feel like January took forever or it just flew right by? I've heard people say both. Hey Tina, hi Diego, Jack, everybody. You're all doing well. Hey Sarah, good to see you. Thinking of buying some new running shoes. I go through them really fast because I rub a lot of miles on the shoes. So it's almost time for me to get another set. So I don't know, I'm thinking about that. I kind of want to get the Adidas Adios Pro. That's the one I've got my eyes on. It's kind of hard to find them. Hey AJ, good to see you. Hi Daniel. Hello. Well, and yeah, we're just hanging in there for about 3 more minutes. Hi, Sylvia. Oh yeah, Hokas are great. I've had several pairs of Hokas. Most recently, the Carbon X. But I really got hooked on these carbon plate type of, I don't know if you know about these, but like the Nike Next Percent, Vaporfly Next Percent, Alpha Fly shoe. So those will really help a lot, I think, with a bit of additional speed. But Hokas are great for recovery, and they're also good for just kind of cruising. My brother actually just bought the Carbon X2 this weekend, and he's having a good time with those. Yeah, I have a lot of shoes, some for running, and then obviously just casuals and stuff. Hey everyone, good to see you all here. Yeah, sneaker talk. I don't know. I'm always looking to cop something, but it's been a little while with the pandemic. You really don't have as much opportunities to show off the shoes, but yeah, I think I might finally get a pair of Air Force Ones. I've always been more of an Adidas person, but they got so many cool colorways now that might have to happen this year. Good to see everyone here. New Nike was a lot of them. You're talking about like athletic shoes, like there's the Tempo Next Percent. I've been keeping up with what they're releasing, but I'm not sure exactly which one you mean. Hi David, hi Anthony, Gabby, Kirsten. Everybody else, appreciate your guys' attendance. Just a few more seconds and then we'll get things going here. Hello, hello. Oh, the hands-free shoe. I have seen that, yeah. I'm not sure if it's that important to not have to take a few additional seconds to put on the shoe, but it looks pretty cool the way that they just slip right on and then kind of clamp to your foot. Yeah, I would wear those. Why not? All right, guys. Well, it's pretty much 2:30, so welcome back. Good to see everyone. So just if you'd like to try and record your presence here, you can make a comment, and if you are using a username that's different from your real name, at least until I get kind of more, in the habit of remembering what the real name is for the username, go ahead and just maybe put your name in there in the chat so that I can make sure that I had a record of you being here. Okay, so that's just my first thing I'm going to say. Other than that, welcome back, everyone. It's Monday, February the 1st, and we're into week 2 now of our class. And thanks everybody for your attendance, contributions, and all your hard work and study so far. So let me start off by just kind of reviewing and going over the last lecture with you and just kind of hitting some of the main points. Then we're going to go from there and keep building on the same topic. Okay, so thanks guys for all of your greetings and stuff. First of all, the first subject in this class is about philosophy of religion. And what we're trying to do is understand what are some of the arguments that have been presented throughout history that have tried to make a case that God exists. What are some of the criticisms of those arguments, and everything in between. So I started at the beginning of our book with one pretty classical argument for God's existence that traces back to the year 1077. So that's the ontological argument by the philosopher Saint Anselm, who lived from 1033 to 1109. And we were breaking down that argument last time, trying to just make sure we're all clear about the basic points that it is making. So first of all, let's see if you can help me restate the information from the argument as a group. It's an argument trying to prove that God exists. Can anybody tell me what assumptions or claims that he makes to get the argument underway? So how does this man Anselm try to make a case that proves God exists? What is his reasoning? Even if it's only half remembered or a little imprecise, whatever you suggest or give me, I'll work with it and then I'll clarify. So tell me if anybody can remember, whether it's in your memory or your notes or some combination of both. How does the ontological argument make the case that God exists? Okay, so first of all, good Sarah, everyone has the same definition of God. Perfect. Yes, also Ismail, to add to that, the definition he thinks that we do all have is God is the greatest conceivable being. Okay, so the being than which none greater can be conceived. The greatest thing you could imagine or think of in your mind. He says that's the general definition of God that everybody has. Oh yeah, we'll get to that, Spencer, the ad absurdum, but let me just make sure to get the main points on the table first. So everyone has this definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. After that, he makes mention of what? He says that there are some things, okay, let's see, Isaac, God is the greatest conceivable being, therefore he must exist, otherwise he would not be the greatest conceivable being. Very good, and that's essentially all correct. God is too great not to exist both in the mind and in reality. Also very good, David. So let me kind of explain some of these comments. He says everyone defines God as the greatest conceivable being. Whether you really believe that he exists or not, we can all, he thinks, agree on at least the definition of the concept, because he believes that's well understood, even to atheists. So is it the case that God only exists in the mind, like a unicorn or a leprechaun, or is God something that exists in both the mind and in reality? Because there are some things that are just in your head and they're not even real, and then there are things that are real, but you can think of them too. He makes mention of the case of a painter who's thinking mentally about a painting that he has yet to paint. Before he paints it, it's not in reality, it's just in his head. Once he paints it on the canvas, he can remember it, think about it whenever he wants, but it's also out there in the world. So his question again is, God, as we've defined him, greatest conceivable being, can it be that he only exists in the mind, or does he exist in the mind and in reality? And then as you guys are pointing out, he tells us that it must be, given his definition as greatest, he must exist in both, because simply it is greater for something to exist in both the mind and in reality than to only exist in the mind merely by itself. So if it's greater to exist in both, and if God is universally defined as the greatest conceivable thing, then he must exist in both. And that means that he's not like the tooth fairy or whatever, but he's something real. He's also real. Beyond that, he says that God cannot even be thought not to exist. Remember that little extra element of his argument? God cannot even be thought not to exist. Why does he say that? Well, it's a sort of repetition of the initial reasoning that led him to conclude that God is real. He says, well, if God's definition is greatest conceivable being, it's greater for something to be unable to be thought not to exist. In other words, it's a deficit, it's a lack, it's an imperfection for something to be capable of being thought not to exist. So since God is perfect, great, the greatest conceivable, he can't lack for anything, including he can't even be thought not to exist. So that means, number one, God must exist in the mind and in reality due to the definition greatest. Furthermore, he can't even be thought not to exist according to the same definition, because if he could be thought not to exist, that would be an imperfection which a perfect being couldn't have. So what's the last point he made after that? He says, well, suppose, of course, there are some who say, I don't think there's a God. But Anselm has gone to some trouble, he's gone to some lengths to try and make the case that this thought cannot even exist. It's not possible to think that there is no God. So what does he say then of the atheists who at least identify as people who say there is no God? What did he say about that concept? If that's not possible, then what's really going on when an atheist says or thinks there's no God? Who can maybe get that point on the table, if you can recall? Follow me, right? He says, God can't be thought not to exist. Too great for that. So good, Tina, exactly. He says, in the mind and speech of a non-believer, the concept of God that they consider when they make these statements is not the real idea of God. So they're thinking of God in name only, but not thinking of the real concept of the greatest conceivable being. So that's how he tries to kind of have it both ways, as it were. Say that God can't be thought not to exist. And the appearance of atheists is really, in a sense, misleading, because although they think they don't believe in God, that's not really the thought that they actually have, because their term of God fails to refer to the real concept. Okay? And somebody mentioned reductio ad absurdum, and I would just close with the summary by mentioning that one more time. Reductio ad absurdum is a logical tactic of argument where you basically concede the point of your opponent and then show that that would lead to something absurd or impossible. So therefore, they're wrong and your position is correct. Like, suppose I wanted to show you that, the planet is not flat, and I'm dealing with a flat earther. So I say, look, my friend, it is not flat. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that it was. Let's just go down that little rabbit hole. If it was flat, like you think, then people would be constantly falling off the edge, and the entire surface of the Earth would be illuminated at once. But that's absurd. That doesn't happen, so we can conclude that it's not flat. You saw what I did there? I assumed, just for a moment, the opposite of my actual position, merely to show that it leads to something that can't be true. And in that case, it can be disqualified in my own belief, then is the correct one. So in Anselm's argument, he says, first of all, God, he doesn't only exist in the mind. He exists in the mind and in reality. But suppose that he did only exist in the mind. Assuming God only exists in the mind, he's no longer the greatest conceivable being, but that's absurd. So we have the conclusion that he's both in the mind and in reality. And then after that, he says, suppose God could be thought not to exist. Well, in that case, he'd be less than perfect, so that can't be true. So he is incapable of being thought not to exist. Okay, so great. Now, what we're going to do from here is start to build up objections to this argument. So I'm sure some of you felt like this argument, there's got to be something wrong with it. There's got to be a way to push back and show that it's not a great argument. I mean, I'm sure many of us believe in God, but even if you do, some people are unimpressed by this attempt to prove his existence that Anselm gives. So if you've had that thought, that the argument is somewhat problematic or you find fault with it, then you'll like today's meeting, because we're really going to try and poke holes in it every which way by looking at a trio of critics that have all found fault with it. Okay, and so I remind you again that in a philosophy class, that's the whole game. You learn an argument, and then you learn a counter argument, like an argument and a rebuttal, and you have to just kind of comprehend both sides. So let's move then to the objections. Today's class meeting is focused on this topic: objections to the ontological argument of Saint Anselm. So objections are just counter arguments, pretty much. You know, like someone makes a case for something, and you say, no, not true, your argument's wrong, and here's why. And then they state their logical response. So every argument in philosophy, and really in life, is challenged. There's no such thing as an undisputed argument that everyone can all equally agree on. And so with Anselm's ontological argument, you've heard it. You've heard how he tries to make the case for God. Now you're going to learn what some of his critics and intellectual opponents have said against the same argument. So objections. We're starting with one by this man, and his name is Gaunilo. So Gaunilo and his biography is a little obscure because he lived in the same time as Anselm. He was a monk. He was a Christian monk. So he was certainly a believer in God, very devoutly so. I mean, if you're a monk, you devote everything to the practice of your chosen religion. So he's not a non-believer, but he's not a fan of the ontological argument either. So he believes in God, but not based on Anselm's argument, and he tries to show us what he thinks is wrong with it. In the book, it says this about him. It just says, Gaunilo was a Benedictine monk who lived around the same time as St. Anselm. Not much is known about his life beyond this and this writing that has survived from him. So about a year after the Proslogion was published by Anselm, Mr. Gaunilo wrote this essay, and it's a criticism of the argument. It's called In Behalf of the Fool. In Behalf of the Fool, and this is dated at around the same time in history as the Proslogion. So we're talking about approximately 1078 AD, around 1,950 some odd years ago. Okay, so Gaunilo the monk, In Behalf of the Fool. The title of the paper is kind of clever because if you remember, Anselm insisted on referring to the atheists of the world as the fool, quoting the Psalms from the Bible, which says the fool hath said in his heart there is no God. So it's kind of a pejorative, obviously. People don't like to be called a fool. Gaunilo is taking up the banner of the fool. He says, let me make an argument on the behalf of the so-called fool. So this is a defense of the non-believer, or at least the person who doesn't find the ontological argument convincing. So he's going to stand up and try and justify their position. So the first paragraph of his essay is simply where he summarizes and restates Anselm's original argument. He does that so that the reader will know what it is that he's going to criticize next. But I like that summary that he gives because I find it to be very clear and compact. So I'm going to read it. Just understand this part is where he is saying what Anselm's argument is. And so he says on page 17, this is Gaunilo, to one doubting whether there is or denying that there is something of such a nature than which nothing greater can be thought, it is said in the Proslogion that its existence is proved. First, because the very one who denies or doubts it already has it in his mind, since when he hears it spoken of, he understands what is said. And further, because what he understands is necessarily such that it exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And this is proven by the fact that it is greater to exist both in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. Because if this same being exists in the mind alone, anything that existed also in reality would be greater than this being, and thus that which is greater than everything would be less than something and would not be greater than everything, which is a contradiction. Therefore, it is necessarily the case that that which is greater than everything, being already proven to exist in the mind, should exist not only in the mind but also in reality, since otherwise it would not be greater than everything. Okay, so here he has summarized the argument, and now he goes forward to criticize it. Now, the criticism that Gaunilo makes of the ontological argument relies crucially on a hypothetical scenario. And I need you guys to kind of get comfortable with the idea of weird hypothetical scenarios in philosophy, because this is the first, but not at all the last time that you're going to hear these presented in these writings of philosophers. A lot of times when constructing arguments, philosophers, lawyers, just intellectuals of all stripes will present a hypothetical scenario so that you can consider a concept in the abstract. The point of the hypothetical is not that it be realistic, but just that it give you the ability to think of a conceptual point within an argument. So bear with me as I try to give you his hypothetical that criticizes the ontological argument. So he says, I want you to imagine, if you can, an island, and we're going to call this island the Lost Island. Okay? And he says, while you're thinking of this island in your head, I want you to imagine it like this, that it's great, that it's like amazing. Whatever makes islands nice, good, great, this one is fully maxed out in that way. So not only is it a great island, but it's, wait for it, it's the greatest conceivable island. You heard? So that's what it is, the greatest conceivable island. Lost Island, it's the greatest conceivable island. Atlantis, well, you know, we've heard mythological, fabled lands like, you know, hidden and now long lost, submerged, things like that. But it's not necessarily, it's just, first of all, this precedes the entire, I believe, myth of Atlantis in history. Or if it doesn't, it's not related. But it's a nice reference to touch with as we mention this concept. But you don't need to have any familiarity with literature or the works of other writers at all. Just think in the abstract of a great island, which is the perfect island, and it's the greatest conceivable one. Meaning that this island, you couldn't ever think of one that was better. So whatever it is that makes islands great, this one's perfect in that way. So obviously, if you can sort of see what he's doing here, he's using this island as a kind of stand-in for Anselm's definition of God, right? Because when Anselm made his argument, he says, we have the idea of God in our head, and what is it? It's the greatest conceivable being. And then from there, you know, the argument takes off, and he thinks he can prove that he exists just based on the definition right there. Now Gaunilo says, okay, well, let me give you something to consider. Think of an island and think of the greatest conceivable island. Now, if there's this greatest conceivable island, he says, according to the logic of Anselm, what would we have to assume about this island? You know, if Anselm's reasoning is valid and correct, then what would we say of the so-called lost island? Do you think you can make this connection? So if it's true that the greatest conceivable being has to exist in the mind and in reality, then what about the lost island? That it would have to exist in both. Exactly, Ishmael, because according to the definition of God, greatest conceivable being has to be real, because otherwise it would be less than perfectly great. So he says, all right, well, I can play that game too. Let me make up the idea of a lost island. And then you, Anselm, according to what you have put forward, you have to assume this island really exists, right? Because it's not the greatest conceivable island if it's just in your head. But now look, don't you understand that despite this, we all know that there is no such thing as the lost island. It's just a completely imaginary idea. So he says, this proves something. You cannot conclude that something exists in reality just by having a definition of it as the greatest conceivable whatever. If that was a way of making a proof, then I could sit back and I could prove to you, attempt to quote unquote prove to you, the existence of all kinds of things that we know just do not exist. What if I say to you, imagine the best song, the greatest conceivable piece of music? Okay, well, if it's something that you have an idea of, then it must also be real, because really existing is part of it being the greatest. But we all know that there's no such thing as that. Or I could say the greatest burger, you know, imagine the perfect burger, the burger than which none greater can be conceived. So to eat this burger is to eat the perfect burger, and none could be better. Now you have an idea of it, boom, I guess it must also exist, because it's greater for something to really exist than for it to just be an idea. Now, hopefully you kind of see what he's doing. He's turning the tables on Anselm. He says, if I grant you your argument strategy, it can be used to prove all these other things that we know just don't exist. So that must mean that there's a flaw in the way you're arguing. Because the case of the lost island and God, they kind of stand and fall together. If this is not a way that proves the existence of the island, then you shouldn't have any confidence that it proves the existence of anything else either, including God. Do you kind of follow me, guys, what I'm saying here? So maybe someone can offer me like a little summary statement of how Gaunilo tries to push back against Anselm. How does he repurpose this example of an island to show a problem with Anselm's argument? If you have a way of saying that or putting it into a few statements, let's see it in the chat. And it's okay if it's imprecise. Again, I'll always help out in this and clarify what I can. But he makes an argument by analogy. He says, your example is like an analogy to this island. But let me see how you would report on that. If I asked you, how does Gaunilo criticize Anselm's argument? What would you say? Just having the idea of a perfect thing doesn't prove that it's real, but maybe you can be more detailed. Let's see. Okay, Jack. Something perfect cannot be assumed to exist, correct? Because of this example of the island. We know there's no such thing as a perfect island in this world or anywhere else. But the logic of Anselm would lead us to the conclusion that it must exist, just because of how we define it in our head. So that's an illegitimate form of reasoning. It proves too much in a way. It proves the existence of things that are known to just not really exist. Gabby, some sort of manipulation of words by using the perfect island. Fair enough, yes. Ismail, if you apply anything as being the greatest, his argument says it has to exist. But it doesn't apply to everything, so it can't be used at all. That's very good. Let me read then the words of Gaunilo. And you can sort of see how our discussion here matches up to what he wrote back then. So he says, the fool can reply that this thing is said to exist in the mind only in the sense that I understand what is said. Because couldn't I say that all kinds of unreal things not existing in themselves in any way at all are equally in the mind? Since if anyone speaks about them, I will understand what he says. And he says, for example, they say that there is in the ocean somewhere an island which, because of the difficulty of finding that which does not exist, some have called the lost island. And the story goes that it is blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance, much more even than the Happy Isles, and having no owner or inhabitant, it is superior everywhere in abundance of riches to all the other lands that men inhabit. Now, if anybody told me that it is like this, I would easily understand what is said, since nothing is difficult about that. But if he then went on to say, as though it was just a logical consequence, that you cannot anymore doubt that this island that is more excellent than all other lands truly exists somewhere in reality, then you can doubt that it is in your mind. And since it is more excellent to exist not only in the mind, but also in reality, therefore it must be that it exists, because if it didn't exist, any other land existing in reality would be more excellent than it. And so this island, already conceived by you to be more excellent than all others, would not be more excellent. Now he says here, this is key, he says, if someone tries thus to persuade me that the island really exists beyond all doubt, I should either think that he was joking, or I would find it hard to decide which of us I should judge to be the bigger fool. Me, if I agree with him, or he, if he thinks that he's proving the existence of the island with any certainty, unless he had first convinced me that its very excellence exists in my mind precisely as a thing existing truly and undoubtfully, and not just as something unreal or doubtful. And that is how the fool might reply to objections. Okay, so he says in that passage, according to Anselm's logic, this island invented by me in the mind as the greatest really has to exist. But that is clearly absurd. We know that that's not true. So instead of accepting this conclusion, we should reject the frame of argument that he uses in attempting to prove that God exists. And let me see if there's more comments here that I've not looked at. Gaunilo plugged different variables into the same equation where the equation is the ontological argument. That's one way to put it. Yeah, he said the whole structure is greatest conceivable thing has to exist. So let me make up a different greatest conceivable whatever and call it the greatest island. According to what Anselm argues, this must exist. But come on, we know that that's not true. So we should find fault with his argument instead of accepting its conclusion. At least it doesn't prove the existence of God, even if maybe God exists for different reasons. River, He's basically saying that if we go by Anselm's logic, then that logic would force us to conclude that many things exist which do not. Very good, yes. Sarah, isn't the idea of a perfect thing based on one's opinion? Well, you know, that's an interesting point. You could say what's perfect is somewhat subjective, but if there's any such thing as a qualitative measure of how good something is, all he's really saying is this is the best island along whatever metric of evaluation constitutes better and worse. But he leaves it open to the reader to fill in the blank with what precise things they might say add up to that greatness. It's sort of like, I mean, it's just a generic phrase, greatest conceivable, and it's a reasonable point you're making. Like, doesn't that leave us still wondering exactly what qualities figure into being great? I think for the purposes of his argument, he doesn't feel that he has an obligation to state that in more detail because Anselm kind of doesn't do so, and so he thinks I'm just going to take the material of Anselm and work with it. But good question. And Derek, just because we think does not mean it is. Okay, good, Derek, but I would ask you to add one more level of depth because it's not just that Anselm says anything you can think of is real. That argument would clearly fail on its face because there's all kinds of fake things, unicorns, leprechauns, whatever. It's more specifically this extra element of it being the greatest conceivable thing. So I would only rephrase your statement this way. Just by having an idea of a greatest thing of whatever kind does not mean that that so-called greatest idea has to be something real also. Okay, so that's, I think, the precise way of putting it. Okay, guys, so good. To this point, we've looked at one argument and one objection to it. And think about how, in a way, Gaunilo is also using reductio ad absurdum, but against Anselm's argument, right? Reductio says, assume your opponent's position just to show that it leads to something impossible or ridiculous. And like in Gaunilo's case, he says, well, let's play Anselm's game. Assume that if there's something that's thought of as the greatest, then it must be real. Well, if that assumption is made, then we would have to imply that the lost island is real, but that's ridiculous. So, in other words, we're going to find a fault with the argument method given by Anselm that leads to that conclusion. Okay, but there's more objections to the ontological argument than just this one from Gaunilo. So what we're going to next do is we're going to actually jump about 1,000 years forward in time, closer to the current day, and we're going to learn about two more philosophers who also had problems with the ontological argument, and they gave their reasons for objection. So moving on to the next. Okay, so the next critic, the next objection to the ontological argument comes to us from this philosopher. His name is G.E. Moore. And his life spanned from 1873 to 1958. And so he's a British philosopher of the late 19th and early 20th century, and he presented this paper at a conference in 1935. And it's overall, it's a criticism of the ontological argument. What it's called is this: is existence a predicate? Okay, so G.E. Moore, British philosopher of the 20th century, 1935, is existence a predicate? And you can see this paper appears like about 900 years later than the original proslogion where the ontological argument was first found. And so I guess that gives you a sense of how timeless and enduring these puzzles and problems are in philosophy. I mean, we've got people talking to each other from almost 1,000-year divide, at least about the same argument. Okay. Now G.E. Moore is going to try his hand at rebutting the argument and showing problems with it. So it's called is existence a predicate? The first thing I would like to go over to examine his paper is to make sure everyone understands what this word predicate refers to. What is a predicate? Okay, so predicate is just a sort of fancy-sounding piece of terminology that's used in logic and sometimes grammar. But what it really means is something not too hard to understand. It's just an attribute or a quality of a thing. It's a feature of something. An attribute or feature of something. So it is said that every complete sentence combines a subject and a predicate. The subject of the sentence is the main thing that's the topic of the sentence being discussed or described, and a predicate is whatever attribute or quality is assumed to be associated with the subject. So as an example, take this sentence, the dog is brown. Okay, if you had to guess, what would you say is the subject of that sentence, the dog is brown? Let's see what you give me in terms of your reaction to that one. Sentence, the dog is brown. Question, what's the subject? Easy enough, I hope, but let's see what you know. Yes, it's the dog. The dog is the subject of the sentence. Now, what would you assume or guess is the predicate of the same sentence? Again, the statement sentence that the dog is brown. Dog is the subject. What's the predicate? Attributed of the subject. What do you think that one is? Yes, it's the quality, the attribute, the feature of being brown. So the subject, the dog, the predicate, the quality or feature of being brown. That's a characteristic feature of it. It's an attribute of it. Okay, so every different sentence we can think of along the same lines. If I say to you that Dr. Vulich is a professor, Dr. Vulich is the subject, being a professor is the predicate, the subject that the subject has, that is attributed to him or me in that case. My sweater is blue. Sweater is the subject, blue is the attribute. Life is difficult. Life being the subject of the sentence, quality of difficult being its attribute. Okay, so anyway, now we can return to the title of his paper now with more understanding. His question in the title is existence a predicate? In other words then, is the concept of existence an attribute, a feature of something or not? Now, a sort of preview of his main argument here. He says, as he argues, no, existence is not a predicate. But he believes that once we see that idea, once we see that existence is not a predicate, then we will realize that it causes the ontological argument to fall apart. Because as he reads the argument, it assumes this, that if God is really perfect, then he has to have every perfect quality. He has to be perfect in all ways. So he has to have all the knowledge, all the goodness, all the power, all the presence. But not only that, he has to exist, says Anselm. Because existence is one attribute that if you don't have it, you're not absolutely perfect and great. So it's like, according to Anselm's argument, existence is treated as though it's just another feature that a thing could either have or not have. And if you lack that feature, you're not as great as something that has that so-called feature. But now enters G.E. Moore 900 years later, and he says, hold on though, wait a minute. Existence, there's a problem. Existence is not an attribute if you really think about it clearly. And if it's not an attribute, then it will not serve the purposes of Anselm's argument the way that he wants. Only on the assumption that it's a predicate would we think that a perfect being would have to have that feature. But if it's not a predicate at all, then there's no connection between thinking that something is perfect and therefore it must exist. So now is Moore's goal to show us why he thinks existence is not a predicate. Okay, so what I would tell you in the first place here, before I jump into his example, is think about it from a common sense level. When you try to describe things, that's when you get into talking about what attributes something has. And I can think of all kinds of examples where you might give a description of something. Say you were putting a car on the market and you were trying to sell it, right? You can't just be like, hey, car for sale, 10,000 bucks. You got to tell people about what the car is. So you would say, I don't know, Ford Bronco 2012. You might give the make, the model. You might talk about what features it has. You might talk about its paint job, color, its mileage. But here's one thing that you would never put in the ad. Okay, so my car, it's got a 4 doors, it's got a sunroof, it's got about 80,000 miles. It exists is another one of its best features. It's got a nice kind of carpeted interior. Now, one of those things doesn't fit, and it stands out, and it's different from the other things. And you probably got the feeling that it was mentioning that the car exists in describing its features. To say that something exists is not really to give a description of what it's like or what features it bears. It seems more like a prerequisite for it to even have features in the first place, because something that doesn't exist just isn't anything at all. Or if you were describing yourself, sometimes you describe yourself in job interviews, in biographies that you write on social media, I don't know. Wouldn't it be weird for somebody to say, hey, so me, I'm a big time reader, I'm very active with sports, and I try to maintain fitness. I major in finance, I exist. I'm about 5'10". Like, see again there, mentioning the existence in the list of attributes stands out like a sore thumb. It's something that's not at all expected or appropriate in listing the way a thing is in terms of its attributes. So I'm just talking to you there from a level of common sense. Like, you would never mention existence in a way of describing something. And that does give you, I think, an insight into the author's claim that existence is not a proper predicate. But for better or worse, he makes his own example to make this point, and so we're going to have to review that, which is a little more confusing in certain ways than my common sense examples presented to you just now. Like, you would never describe a house or car on the market as existing, or yourself. It's a given, right? Well, let's consider then what his actual example is. Now, first of all, let me make sure we're all still in good contact with each other. Can you hear me, see me? Live feed is working properly. Let me just see any comment from you to make sure that we're all in good connection before I move into the next point. Just checking in with the group. Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys. I see your comments. So, all right. G.E. Moore's examples now. So his criticism does rely on an interesting but also a little awkward example. But I'm going to help you guys bring it down to earth so it's not so strange in the end, okay? Now, he says to see how existence is not a predicate, what we should do is compare two sets of sentences. One of these sets is going to have a real predicate in it. And the other one is going to have the same statements, except we are going to substitute the predicate with the verb exists. And what you'll see, he believes, is that by substituting the predicate with the word exists, we generate these new sentences that do not make logical sense, at least not obvious logical sense. So he directs our focus to these sentences concerning tigers. And the sentence of interest is tigers growl. Tigers growl. He says this single sentence, that tigers growl, can be divided into 3 possible variations. And that will be 3 different prefixes, all, most, or some. So I'm going to write those here. All tigers growl. Most tigers growl. And some tigers growl. Almost some tigers growl. Now, as we've said, and now I think you probably will know, what's the subject of this group of sentences? Easy enough. Let me know. The subject is just clearly what thing in these examples here? Tigers, good. Now, what is the predicate in these sentences? The predicate associated with the tigers is the quality, feature, or the attribute of, let's wait for it. Good, about tigers growling, yes. So this sentence combines the subject tiger with the predicate growls. What we should know here by looking at these 3 is that although they each say something slightly different, all of them make coherent sense. None of these statements provokes a response of like, I have no idea what that even means. They're all clearly meaningful and easy to understand. This says that out of the tigers, all of them growl and none of them don't. So like, if this is true, then there's no tiger that doesn't growl, because each and every one does. For most tigers growl to be true, what would that have to involve? If most tigers growl, then how many of them do? Let me see if anyone can just parse that one. In terms of quantity, if most of them growl, what does that mean in other words? Some don't, but how many? A majority or a minority? You kind of know what I'm talking about? If it's most. Well, okay. Good, David, you got it. Most tigers growl doesn't say 3/4 because 3/4 is most, but 60% is most, 55% is most, just more than half, okay? So a majority. Less than half, that wouldn't make sense, River, come on. If most tigers growl, it wouldn't be less than half because less than half is not most. But now hopefully we're all on the same page. So if this is true, 100% of them do. If this does, it's at least one more than 50%. And now for some tigers to growl, that would only involve not even that most, but just what? Oh yeah, not so worried. Good, River, just kind of clarifying. But about the third one, for some tigers growl to be true, that doesn't even require that it's more than half. That just requires at a minimum what? If some tigers growl is true, at least what? I'm just asking about the third one on the bottom there. Just check that we're on the same page with that. All, 100%. Most, more than half. Some, what is that? At least one. Very good. Correct. Yeah, at least one. If at least one tiger growls, then there's some tigers that growl, even if no others do. Okay, now, so I just walked you through how to understand what each of these mean. And there's nothing strange, bizarre, or puzzling about what those sentences mean. If somebody walked up to you and said, hey, most tigers growl, I don't think you would be like, huh? I mean, it would be a weird thing from the start of the conversation with fair, but just in terms of what the sentence means, it wouldn't leave you like, huh, I have no idea what that means. But now what we're going to do is substitute the predicate here, growls, with the word exists. And then you're going to see a breakdown in the logical meaning of these sentences, okay? And that's what he thinks exposes the fact that existence is not a predicate. So now what we have is this. All tigers exist. Most tigers exist. And some tigers exist. Okay, so what we have to recognize here is that by replacing growl with exists, two of these three sentences no longer make any kind of coherent sense, or at least it's not obvious what sense it makes. Let's go, for example, into the second case here. Most tigers exist. Now, when we said most tigers growl, we indicated that that means that more than half of them do at least. But for most tigers exist to be true, modeled on the same analysis, it would have to mean that more than half of the tigers exist, but then perhaps some of them don't. But there's no way to divide the quantity of existing tigers from non-existing tigers, because things that don't exist simply don't have a number that can be quantified, right? So like there's 43 of us right now present at this meeting. If I say most of you guys are not wearing glasses, that's easy to understand. It just means that out of the number 43, more than half of that are not wearing glasses. But if I say most students exist, instead of most students are wearing no glasses, there's nothing that can be compared against the existing students. So in a set of students in a class, some wearing glasses, some not. We can count up the number of them that have the attribute and those that do not. But there's no way of creating a number of tigers that don't exist, which could be compared against the number that do exist. Look around your room right now. How many non-existent tigers are there in the room? I hope you understand that this question does not make sense. Only things that do exist can be counted and numbered. Things that don't exist clearly don't even have an identity to be counted. So most tigers exist leads us nowhere in terms of meaning. The best attempt to attach a meaning to it is to say that most of them exist, more than half of them exist, a majority exist, and a minority don't. But it makes no sense to talk about a majority and a minority when the set of things are not all existing things. So does this make sense to you? Like, Okay, so Kim, interesting point. You talk about the tigers that have gone extinct, like maybe the old saber-toothed tiger. And I guess you'd be thinking then about like species of tiger, like Bengal tigers, white tigers exist, and they're still here. But then there's a couple of extinct species of tigers that no longer exist. And so concerning species of tiger, most exist and some don't. But that's a different case because, as you've mentioned there, sorry for forgetting your handle's real name associated, but horrible art, species-wise. But individual tigers are being mentioned here in these sentences, so it's a little different. Anyway, look, big picture. Most tigers exist, makes no obvious sense. It makes sense to say that like most people are short or most people are tall because we can simply take the set of all people that exist and divide them in terms of whether they have this quality or not. But given a set of existing things, they can be divided. Mentioning a set of things that exists as opposed to a set of things that doesn't exist makes no logical sense at all. Same with all tigers exist. Okay, so with all tigers growl, the meaning that we talked about was every tiger growls and there is no tiger that does not growl. But to interpret this along the same lines, we would have to say that all tigers exist and there is no tiger that does not exist. But for that to have any kind of interpretation, we would have to know what it means for there to be a non-existing tiger. And once again, it seems like it's a contradiction in terms. Talking about a thing that doesn't exist is talking about nothing at all. To give an even further illustration of how illogical and confusing the sentences are when exists is taking the place of the predicate, let's compare these two sentences with a negative form. So if I say some tigers don't growl, that should not be confusing. It just means that there's at least one tiger out there that doesn't have that feature. But if I create a parallel sentence which says some tigers don't exist, now it's fair to say nobody knows what I'm talking about. Some tigers don't exist. What are they? It's like saying there are some things that are not things. So in the end, this is the only variation where existence takes the place of the predicate that makes some kind of sense. Because some tigers exist doesn't require a comparison between the case of the existing and the so-called non-existing tiger. But in every other variation on the sentence, the exists version of it makes no sense. And so what is Moore saying? G.E. Moore, the British philosopher here, he's saying that if existence was a predicate, then when you swapped it out for a different predicate, it would still make just as much sense. And with other genuine predicates, they do. If I say all tigers growl or all tigers have stripes, most tigers growl, most tigers have stripes, no problem. But once I switch from most tigers growl to most tigers exist, now we see that existence cannot take the place of a predicate and give us the same kind of straightforward, easy to interpret sentence. And he thinks that is the linguistic reason that's shown as to why existence is not a predicate. Because it is not interchangeable with other predicates in a given sentence and still leaving us with the same kind of clear, comprehensible meaning. So, I mean, to oversimplify a bit, placing existence in the sentence instead of growls turns the sentence into just gibberish. And he thinks that shows us this logical point, which is to his larger argument, that existence is not actually an attribute. Knowing that it's not an attribute, it will not serve Anselm's argument the way he thinks that it will. Because going back to Anselm, he said that if God's the greatest conceivable being, then he cannot lack for any attribute. And if he didn't have existence, well, then he'd be missing one of the great attributes, and so he can't be missing that. Now, Moore says, but hold on, who said existence is an attribute? It's not really an attribute. You can understand that just by thinking of how no one describes things as existing. But if you want even more detail, think about how replacing a sentence with a predicate with the verb exists transforms the sentence into one that makes pretty obvious sense into a new sentence that either makes no sense or it's hard to understand what sense it makes. Now, here's the last thing I'm going to say about Moore's essay here. He makes this point at one time in the essay. He says, all right, if you really wanted to force these sentences with the word exists in them to have some kind of clear enough meaning, maybe what is meant is that like some tigers are imaginary. So like, in the world of cartoons and media, probably some of you have heard of like Tony the Tiger, the mascot for Frosted Flakes. Maybe some of you have ever read comic strips and you know about Calvin and Hobbes. I think, is it Calvin or is it Hobbes? Whatever, but there's a little cartoon where there's like a tiger that's his friend, his imaginary friend. There's also Winnie the Pooh and Tigger, and you know he's like a cartoon tiger. So you could say, oh, when it says most tigers exist, that means most tigers are flesh and blood, you know, out there in the field. And then there's a minority of them that are just made up imaginary tigers. But even if that is one way to like really stretch the meaning of this so that it has some kind of interpretation we can understand, it's still not a clear and straightforward interpretation. Any other predicate aside from exists would not have required us to like deviate into the world of fiction and imaginary objects in order to make sense of the statement. So, long story short, the sentences where existence takes place of growls either make no sense or they only make sense according to a very weird interpretation which brings into the discussion imaginary and fictional objects. So once again, he thinks it proves his point. Existence doesn't operate the way a real predicate does. And so nobody should think that you can prove a being exists just on the basis that it's got to be perfect and so it can't lack any features. Now let me read his words on it, and maybe you'll be able to connect, you know, what I've said here to his writing. So he says, page 19, leading over to 20. The sentence tame tigers growl seems to me to be ambiguous. So far as I can see, it could mean all tame tigers growl, or it could mean most. Quick note, in his writing, I should have mentioned this, you'll notice that he has the more complicated sentence, tame tigers growl, all tame tigers growl, most tame tigers growl. I just eliminated the word tame from the in-class discussion of it because I felt that it doesn't add anything to his analysis. It just makes it more confusing because tame is a different predicate. So I try to simplify a bit, to streamline the presentation of information by just going with all tigers instead of tame. So just note that. But anyway, each of these sentences has a clear meaning, and the meaning of each is clearly different from that of the other two. Of each of them, however, it is true that the proposition which it expresses is one which couldn't be true unless some tigers growl. And hence I think we can say of tigers growl that whatever sense it is used in, it means something which can't possibly be true unless some tigers growl. Now, similarly, I think it is clear that tigers exist means something which cannot possibly be true unless some tigers exist. But I do not think that there is any ambiguity in tigers exist corresponding to that which I had pointed out in tigers growl. So far as I can see, tigers exist and some tigers exist are merely two different ways of saying the same thing. That is to say, it is not true that tigers exist might mean all tigers exist or most do, instead of merely some. It always means just some exist and nothing else. Moving to the next page. I think this could be made clear by comparing the expressions some tigers don't growl and some tigers don't exist. The former, whether true or false, has a perfectly clear meaning, a meaning just as clear as that as some tigers do growl. But with some tigers don't exist, the case is different. Some tigers exist has a clear meaning, but the meaning of some tigers don't exist, if any, is certainly not clear. It is a puzzling expression. Has it any meaning at all? And if so, what meaning? If it has any, it would appear that it must mean the same as there are tigers which don't exist. But what does that mean? Is it possible that there should be tigers which do not exist? So he's saying in this writing the same thing I tried to explain to you here, that with existence in replacement of the predicate, we are led into confusion, paradox, and just puzzlement as to how to interpret the statement. Now he says later on, the meaning which the expression tigers don't exist sometimes has is that which it has when it is used to mean the same as some tigers are imaginary or some tigers are not real. That some tigers are imaginary may express a sentence. I don't think that can be denied. If, for example, two different stories have been written, each of which is about a different imaginary tiger, it will follow that there are at least two imaginary tigers. And it cannot be denied that the sentence two different tigers occur in fiction has a meaning, though I have not the least idea whether it's true or false. I know that at least one unicorn occurs in fiction because there's one in Alice in Wonderland, and it follows that there is at least one imaginary unicorn, and therefore at least one unicorn which doesn't exist. But he says, the sentence "there are tigers which don't exist" is certainly significant if it means only that there are some imaginary tigers in either of those two senses that I've tried to point out. But what it means is that either some real people have written stories about these tigers that are imaginary, or are having hallucinations of them, or are dreaming of them, or whatever. If nothing of this sort has happened or is happening, then there are no imaginary tigers. So in the end, this sentence with the word "exists" attached to tigers is either totally meaningless and incoherent, or otherwise means something that ordinary predicates don't require us to think about at all, which is the concept of fictional or imagined tigers. So let us take stock before I move into the discussion of the next author in the lecture series. We're beginning the class with the analysis and the overview of some just classical arguments that God exists, and then now we're looking at objections to clap back and rebut them. The first argument, Anselm's ontological argument, and we should now kind of have a sense of what it says. It says God, we all have a definition of as greatest conceivable being. So in order to be the greatest conceivable being, you have to exist in both the mind and in reality, because it's less great to only exist in the mind. Gaunilo says that argument doesn't work because I can come up with any random idea of a greatest conceivable, whatever you like, suppose greatest conceivable island. And if Anselm's logic were really correct, then that would imply that the island or whatever else is real. But in many of these cases, we know the thing isn't real, so we should be skeptical of the way he argues towards these conclusions. And then there's Moore, thank you, G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore says, my problem with the argument is different from Gaunilo. My main problem is that existence should not be considered to be a predicate. In other words, it should not be considered as an attribute or a feature of anything. The way he goes about showing that is what we've just now mentioned, that with the statements tigers growl, whether it's almost, some, or some don't, they make sense. There's no reason to scratch your head and be like, I don't get what you mean, when all those sentences are put on the table. But if somebody modified the sentences given by putting exists in there, then at least 3 of those 4 would not make sense. All tigers exist, most tigers exist, some tigers don't exist. If those sound weird to you, good, because that means you're getting it. They're intended to be sentences that don't make any sense, or at least don't make immediately obvious sense. So if existence transforms a statement which otherwise would have been clear into one that makes no obvious sense, he believes that's showing us that existence is not a predicate, and therefore that undermines the argument in another way. Okay, but there's still one more critic of Anselm's ontological argument that I want us to go over, and maybe we'll finish with his criticism with the remaining 20 minutes or so. If not, then we'll just roll into the next meeting and wrap it up with whatever time we need to, a couple minutes at the beginning on Wednesday. Okay, so I'm erasing this. And one more quick objection to the ontological argument. So this one comes from an even more recent current day philosopher. So this is from philosopher William Rowe. And he was a professor at Purdue University, so he taught for a long time, but he retired in 2005. This is from a book that he wrote in 1993. And the excerpt that's in our anthology is called "Why the Ontological Argument Fails." Why the Ontological Argument Fails, Professor William Rowe, 1993. So you can see that he's right there in the title, kind of just bluntly stating, this argument fails, and I'm here to show you why it does. So he's not at all a fan of the argument. He's an atheist, so I guess he hasn't been convinced by any argument that God exists, but he calls this one out for specific criticism here. And the first thing he says as he opens it up is, just by analyzing our thoughts and ideas, we can never prove that something really exists in reality, just by examining, definitions, ideas, and concepts in the mind. And he thinks that the problem with the ontological argument is that they try to define God as an existing being, and then say that since that definition holds, it's impossible for him not to exist. To sort of oversimplify, he thinks that the advocates of this argument pretty much define God in this way. God equals the existing perfect being. This is him like reporting on the understanding of God that the fans of this argument have, not his own view. But he says people who follow this argument, that's what they think God's definition is. He's the existing perfect being. And then it's like if you say, wait, but does he exist? The person who gives the argument says, well, hold on, it's in the definition. So if you think he doesn't exist, it's like you're saying the existing being doesn't exist. And that's a contradiction. But now Rowe is here to tell you that you cannot prove that something exists just by defining it to exist. There's no way of making a proof of something's existence just by putting existence in the definition of the word. And that's where he finds fault with the argument. He says it fails because it attempts to prove God exists just by stipulating that existence is a part of his definition. And then it's like it locks you into the conclusion that he exists merely based on the stated definition. So his overall approach right now is to say you can't do that. You can't prove things exist by simply defining them as such. But to be even more clear, he has his own example that I want to help you understand. So I'm going to erase this initial stuff about him. And he says, all right, consider the following example. Let's make up words. We're going to make up two words. And there are two words that have something to do with the concept of magicians. So magician, magicians that exist. Magico, magicians that do not exist. Okay, so I'm going to put these words here. Magician, existing magician. Magico, non-existing magician. Now these are made up words. I mean, he says, I'm just going to make up these words for the sake of the argument to make my point. So let's just assume that the word magician does mean existing magician, and magico means non-existing magician. Here, in this little diagram, I want you guys to help me fill in some examples. So here to the left, on this side of the divider, tell me if you can think of some names of people, real flesh and blood human beings, that are either alive now or they have lived, and that was their job or it is their job, to just do magic tricks and illusion and stuff. What are some famous folks that we all know that would be in this column? Let's see what you got. Okay, Houdini, that's a great example, one of the most famous names. Harry Houdini, master magician and escape artist. He died in the performance of one of his acts. Chris Angel, sure. Is it with a K? I think it is, but I'm not 100% sure. Either way, Chris Angel, the mind freak, some call him. David Blaine. Not Merlin Summer, sorry to say, but Merlin's actually on this side because that's a legendary mythological Knight of the Round Table kind of fable, so it wasn't a real historical figure. But David Blaine, Penn and Teller, even though Penn and Teller kind of have like comedy as a big part of their act, but they do magic tricks. Anyway, we could go on and on, right? David Copperfield and beyond. But just get the idea, right, that whatever is a magician is the set of all the real life magicians that have really lived. But over here, Magico, help me come up with some names on this side. So I'm thinking of like fictional imaginary people, like people that are not real people but have been like movie characters or book characters. Well, we already have Merlin Summer from your earlier suggestion. That's just a fictional magician. What are some others? Doctor Strange, okay. Is it a magician? Is it not? I think it's fair enough, though. It's a fictional character with some kind of powers that border on magical. So, Doctor Strange. Dumbledore, yeah, good. Harry Potter, all those are fine examples. We do magic tricks and wizard stuff. Dumbledore, there's Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings and stuff. Anyway, we could continue on the same theme, but I just wanted to give you a few kind of clear examples. So, all right, magician, magicians that exist. Magico, non-existing magicians. So here's the point he's making next, which is going to connect back to that ontological argument. He says this. Now, it's going to take a little bit of a mental gymnastics for you, but not too bad. If you just follow me, I'm sure you'll be able to think about this. I want you to imagine a counterfactual situation. So I'm asking you, imagine that we're part of this world, but a counterfactual timeline of history. Suppose that people who do magic tricks never existed. Okay, so like imagine the world as we're living in it, except nobody ever did perform tricks like Houdini, Chris Angel, David Blaine. That just never happened. But imagine that in that world where there's never been a real magician. Okay, are you already on the same page imagining that scenario? Imagine that in that scenario, somebody made up the word magic hand. Okay, and they said that what it means is existing magician. Well, would that mean that in that case, magicians have to exist? No. Just the stated word with its definition is powerless to prove the existence of magicians. Magicians do exist in our world, I mean, in the sense that they perform these tricks, not necessarily that the tricks are real magic, but there are people who do that for a living. But even if there weren't any, couldn't we still make up this word just in a dictionary and say it means existing magician? Yes, because we can invent words and meanings as we wish. So in that case, we would have the word that means existing magician, but there wouldn't actually be any such things. So what he's trying to point out to you is that simply from the definition of a word saying existing blank, it doesn't logically imply that that thing has to actually exist, okay? Because again, if contrary to fact there had never been real magicians, we still could have, under those counterfactual conditions, created the word with the meaning that you see here on this board. But it wouldn't have caused magicians to exist. It would have just been to state the definition of a made-up word. So what he's saying is with God, right? God, he believes, is defined in the ontological argument as existing. And then they simply say, well, right there, it's defined as existing, so it must exist. But he says we could be in our universe with no God, and yet we still have the word, which means existing perfect being. But under those circumstances, although the word means existing being, there's no such thing. So he basically thinks that the ontological argument is kind of like a very clever version of wordplay, trying to induce the belief in a thing merely by saying that it's defined as existing. But being defined to exist according to the definition of a word cannot by itself prove that there's anything real that corresponds to the definition. Now, the reason that I find his example a little bit confusing, to be honest, is because you have to think about this contrary to fact supposition. Like imagine yourself in a situation where there weren't magicians and yet the phrase magic hand were still invented. That conceptualization is supposed to give you the idea that though a word can exist, which means that such a being is real, it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be such a thing. But I know it's a little confusing because you have to transport yourself to this imagined counterfactual scenario. So I've come up with a slight variation on his example that I think makes it a little bit easier to understand for an everyday person. So let me just modify his example slightly, okay? Okay, so imagine that we have this word, and it's the word unican. And then over here, we've got a different word, unico. Now, I'm guessing that you can maybe infer what these words are going to be defined as. What do you think unican will mean, following the pattern of our meeting on William Rowe so far? Unican, we will stipulate to just be a word that means by definition what things? What would be the guess? The unican. Seeing the similarity it bears to the term magic hand, that's a big hint. Unicans are going to be, yes, existing unicorns. Good. And unico, in alignment with magico, that, let's say, are the non-existent unicorns, okay? So, we're going to try and give some names here, but we're going to start on this side for obvious reasons, or if it's not obvious, it will become obvious. Let's think of the names of some fictional unicorns. Now, there's not a ton of them, I guess, that are well known to everybody because it's a little more of an obscure pop culture concept, but there have been some notable unicorns in fiction and fantasy that I can think of, and also in some memes and internet culture. Anybody have any? These are suffixes that you can add on to anything. That's correct, yes, Kim. But it's merely for the purposes of objecting to the ontological argument. Yes, we are making it up, 100%. The term unican, it means existing unicorn, and the term unico means non-existing unicorn. And these are words that are invented right now in this class that will never be used outside of the class. So, what are some examples of non-existing unicorns that you can think of, if you can, from fiction, fantasy, or whatever? If you don't have any examples, that's okay, and I'll throw some out there because I've got a couple from my past experiences teaching this. Well, no, you can't just say unicorns. That's a category name. It has to be a specific name, like John the Unicorn, a specific person. Like you're a human being, but you've got a name, Vortex Death Rage. So it's like that. Charlie the Unicorn. Oh, good, Sarah. Yeah, I was thinking someone might come up with that. It's been a while, but there were these memes and stuff where Charlie the Unicorn was like speaking in the memes, and it's funny. My Little Pony. Okay, good. Yeah, I believe there was it Twilight Sparkle or anyway, there's a couple characters in My Little Pony. I think one of them is like a unicorn. Maybe it's Twilight Sparkle, but if it's not, you'll let me know. And you know, like there's been some films where unicorns appeared, but I don't want to go through an exhaustive list. I just want you to know that there's been some like cartoon and like, you know, fiction unicorns from just fantasy. Over here, unican. Can we put anything in this column? Is there any name of any real unicorn? And that's a clear answer. You should be able to tell me that. Why can't I place the name of any actual unicorns there? Well, because there simply don't exist, right? Now, by making up the word existing unicorn, unican, have I proven that unicorns exist just by stipulating the definition of this made-up term? Of course not. Unicorns don't erupt into existence simply by means of me defining a made-up word. So what he's saying is that in the same way, God can be defined as an existing being that's perfect. But if there is no such thing in reality, then despite the definition of the term, it may mean existing being, but there is no such thing. In similarity, the word unican can, and I guess does mean existing unicorn. But you don't even have to imagine a counterfactual scenario to understand that in this actual world, there are no unicorns, despite the invention of this word. So merely by coining a term and saying that by definition it means existing blank, that is not able to prove the real existence of such a thing. Ishmael. But isn't that because the definition of unical, for example, does not include that it is greatest? Oh, no. This is the side that we are focused on now. Unican is what is compared with God and with Magican. In all three of those cases, the common theme that runs through is that it's something defined as existing, but which does not need to exist just because the word has that definition. Imagine this, right? Tomorrow, they round up all the people that are practicing magic today and they execute them. That's a sad thing to think about, but suppose that happened and current day magicians don't exist next week. And then next week, I tell you, think about the word magican, which means existing magician. That would not bring them back. So whether a thing exists or not has nothing to do with the stated definition of a word. Even if something is defined as existing, it's possible for it to not really exist. Okay? And so he thinks that when one tries to prove God exists by defining him as existing, they're not able to make the case that this is real proof. Because in the absence of such a being, which is possible, the word would have its meaning, but there would not be anything real that corresponded to that word. Yeah, so Kim, you're saying dinosaurs. Well, the word dinosaur itself does not convey that it has to exist today. It would just talk about like the species or physiology or whatever of the particular dinosaur that you're talking about. But if I made up a word and I say, good example, Kim. So suppose right now I make up the word dinosan, and I say dinosan means existing dinosaur. So by me making up the word right now, have dinosaurs been brought back and now they roam the earth? Clearly not. So can we all see the connection between these examples of words that are defined as things that exist and the definition stated of God by Anselm. Rowe believes that Anselm has tried to prove the existence of God by pointing out that he is defined as existing. And in criticism of that, he mentions that defining something to exist is not sufficient proof. I can make up a word which defines something to exist that is known not to exist, like the case of unican, existing unicorn. But despite that word, we know they're not real. Now, the reason that I find my own variation on the author's example a little easier for the student to understand than his original is because with magican, we have magicians. So you have to imagine, well, what if they didn't exist, though, and we still use that word? This is a little easier because you don't have to take that little counterfactual step. You just have to understand, no, there's no unicorns. But if I make up the word unican, there's still no unicorns, even if it means existing unicorn. Okay, now I'm going to let you go, but let me close with just a short quote from him, and you can see what he said. He said, magican, existing magician, magico, non-existing magician. What we have just seen is that introducing existing or non-existing into the definition of a word has an important implication. If we introduce existing into the definition, it follows that no non-existing thing could satisfy that concept. But must some existing thing exemplify the concept magican? No. From the fact that existing is included in the definition, it does not follow that some magician has to exist. All that follows is that nothing that doesn't exist would qualify to be a magican. But now, and here's the key passage. If there were no magicians in existence, if there were none, suppose, then there would be nothing to which the term magican would apply. This being so, it clearly does not follow merely from our definition of the term that some existing thing is a magician. Only if they exist will it be true that some existing thing is a magican. And so from the mere fact that God is defined as existing, it will not follow that some being that is real is God. He thinks that a person that's a fan of the ontological argument is just trying to press the case of his existence by stipulating that he's defined as existing. But that's wordplay, that's definition talk. Whether something really exists can't be settled simply by the matter of sitting back in the armchair and thinking about the meaning of words. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for all your great help and contribution. What I always will do is begin each new meeting with a brief summary statement of what we covered previously. So we'll tie up these loose ends again and make sure that we restate and clarify any misunderstandings. And then just continue reading through the syllabus. You'll see pages listed for the Wednesday meeting. Try to read those before Wednesday. And I'll just see you guys back at 2:30 on Wednesday at the same YouTube channel. All right? So thanks, everybody. I don't want to hold you anymore. Take care. And thanks, Jasmine. I see your name there. Have a great day, everyone. And if you need anything, just feel free to email, and I'll be in touch. Okay. Take it easy. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.